James Bond used to be a staple of the gaming industry, with some of the absolute classics like GoldenEye and Everything or Nothing being seen as some of the best or most iconic games of their time. But for a long time now, the 007 franchise has been pretty much MIA within the gaming industry. That is until 007 First Light finally hit the shelves, because despite the mounting pressure on this game and the kind of worrisome first trailer that had a lot of people concerned it would be a flop, it's been nothing but an absolute success, and in my opinion, it has already brought James Bond back to gaming in such a way that I think he'll be hanging around for a very long time. Now, like I said, there was a lot of pressure leading into this game, ultimately because of how long it's been since we've had a good James Bond game. Back in the day, we had the classics like GoldenEye that really set the standard for this IP, and in the last 15 or so years, we haven't really had anything at all, as well as the games that we have gotten over the years not being all that great, even dating back to 2008 with Quantum of Solace, that I remember had a lot of hype leading into it, but unfortunately just never really lived up to it. That on top of the fact that Denis Villeneuve is directing the next Bond film after his astounding success with the Dune franchise, I think there is a lot of hype but also pressure around the Bond IP right now, and you could definitely feel that leading into First Light. That said, I think it massively overcame all of that pressure, and there is a lot of stuff that I wanted to go into as to how this game went about doing that and making a game that is most likely going to end up a Game of the Year nominee come December this year. Now, obviously, I guess the most important part to any game is ultimately the gameplay. I know that in a game like this, there is a lot of story elements and stuff like the cutscenes and stuff that really do matter too, but ultimately, video games are about the gameplay, and especially in a game like this, gameplay needs to be well done or else the game is simply never going to survive. Now, you can break the gameplay down into so many different sections, but I think the part that we need to start with is the stealth, because ultimately this is a James Bond game and it's obviously going to involve a lot of stealth. And to me, the stealth was very, very well done in this game. Now, it wasn't maybe as like genre defining as I thought it might have been, coming from the studio behind Hitman, as well as having spent a lot of time developing this game. I did maybe think the stealth was going to be a little bit more advanced than what we got, but that doesn't mean to say that it was poorly done, because like I said, it was very good stealth in my opinion, and was still probably some of the better stealth gameplay that I've played in years. Something I loved about it is that there were just so many different approaches to pretty much every situation within each mission, from simply staying completely stealthy and just hidden at all times, to using your gadgets to distract or take out enemies, and even down to the level design allowing you to just access different areas and approach missions from the angle that you wanted to approach them. I just thought it was so well done in so many ways. Something that immediately comes to mind when I think of stealth is the chess tournament fairly early on in the game, and just the amount of different ways to get in and out of different areas, sneaking through out of bounds areas, as well as into the areas where there was the more social stealth where you can kind of blend into crowds and stuff like that. It was just so well done, and that mission being so early in the game, it really set the tone, and it made you kind of realize if we're in for a whole game of this level of stealth, it is going to be an absolute banger. Now, something that to me took that stealth to a whole other level was the use of the kind of license to kill mechanic, where we weren't actually allowed to engage in head-to-head combat in terms of like using weapons until that had happened to us. So we kind of needed enemies to start shooting at us, or at least have the intent to kill, before we were able to use our own weapons. And although I have seen some people complain about this, to me I thought that was so well done, not only from a gameplay perspective, because it kind of forced us to approach these missions a little bit differently than we may have if we could just go in guns blazing, but it also made perfect sense with the story. Ultimately, this was a kind of political thing. We didn't want to be shooting first and causing these situations to unfold, because ultimately that can result in full-scale wars. We've literally seen that in human history, and so them including that in this game, where it's kind of like, we are not going to be the ones to cause this drama. If someone shoots at us, then we can go in guns blazing, but until then, the golden rule is that we do not have the license to kill. I personally loved that, and I thought that was so well done. And again, it didn't only suit the story, but it just changed up the gameplay compared to most stealth games I play, where you can just kill people immediately, which ultimately does actually make the stealth a lot easier, because then there's less people to actually find you throughout that mission. Something else that was fairly unique compared to a lot of stealth games was the kind of lack of silenced weapons. Now, obviously later on in the game, we can use silenced pistols and stuff like that. Even some of the SMGs and stuff were silenced, but early on in the game, that wasn't really a thing. And although I do kind of wish we could have used silenced weapons earlier, I think they kind of did that to allow allow players to focus on other methods of stealth and also make the gameplay just that little bit harder. I think it would have probably been a little bit too easy if we just had a silenced pistol from the get-go, because ultimately landing a headshot and not alerting anyone, that would be very, very easy if we could do that from mission 1 onwards. But like I said, I also kind of wish that was a little bit more prominent in the game, because for me, a silenced pistol goes just hand in hand with James Bond. So it did feel like a bit of a missed opportunity there, but again, I understand why they did that, and I'm glad that we at least got that in the later missions anyway. Now, to add even further to the stealth, there was obviously the kind of like trickery side of the game, so bluffing enemies or even faking your surrender in order to get closer to an enemy and then eventually take them out. Those were really good additions in my opinion. Now, at times, it did feel a little bit too easy, if I'm being honest. It kind of lowered the stakes of the stealth a little bit, because if you did get caught, you could just kind of bluff the enemy, and at least as far as I'm aware, that was actually impossible to fail if you just pressed the bluff button. There was no way to actually lose that situation. It would have been probably a little bit better if there was some kind of stakes to it where sometimes you can fail the bluff and then obviously things can kind of go to chaos after that. But again, that's mostly a nitpick. I thought that was a really cool addition where, yes, if you do get caught, you can kind of fall back on just bluffing an enemy or faking your surrender, and you can still kind of salvage those situations, which was, yes, slightly easy, but it was also very fun in those moments. Now, obviously, the gadgets were a huge part of this game as well. There were so many awesome gadgets we could use. There were great ways to distract enemies, also disarming certain tech or making enemies begin to feel sick and actually leave their post. And to me, it felt really enjoyable kind of cycling through each of the gadgets throughout the game, trying each one throughout each mission and sort of learning which ones I preferred to use, rather than just simply using the same things every time and kind of having the same gameplay loop. I loved that we could actually visit the kind of gadget station on queue level between missions to choose what we'd bring along on the next mission. And obviously, as you progress throughout the game, you unlock more and more gadgets that have a lot more different uses. Now, I really liked queue level and kind of getting a closer look at the team who were designing all of these gadgets. Now, I saw some complaints about how much time we actually spent here, and a lot of people weren't overly happy about kind of the in-between missions where you go to Q Lab and you go speak to Q, pick up your gadgets and stuff, and then get back out there. I saw complaints about that, but for me personally, I actually really enjoyed that. I thought it was cool to have just some kind of chill moments between each mission, not only being able to choose your next set of gadgets, but also just learning more about the team making them, because that's something that generally in most like spy movies, we don't get that behind the scenes look at how these gadgets are made. I also really enjoyed the gadget mechanic overall in terms of like having the battery and chemical components that we had to make sure we were stocked up on, otherwise we wouldn't really be able to use them. I thought that was very important to not just be able to spam these, because otherwise they would have been completely overpowered. And obviously the gadgets very much expanded as the game went on. We obviously get the missile pen eventually, and even in the later missions using Recce was a hell of a lot of fun. I don't know who the hell came up with that idea, but this whole mission was just so much fun. And although it was borderline like wacky, I thought it was a really good fit for the game and was probably one of the more memorable parts later on in the story. Something really exciting about the gadgets too is that I feel this is an area they can really expand on in future games. Even though the gadgets that we got in this game were really cool, there weren't that many to choose from, and I think that they can pretty much put all of these into the next game, while also very much expanding on these and having, you know, upwards of say 15 to 20 gadgets to choose from. That's one area that I can really see them kind of advancing the next game, which is very exciting to think about. Now, obviously stealth isn't everything, and the other side of James Bond is that more sort of head-on action that is obviously prominent throughout all of the movies and all of the games as well. And just like the stealth, I thought this was very well done in this game. Actually, probably to a better extent for me. I actually thought that the just head-on action was where I had most of my fun. I enjoyed the stealth, but I think just going in guns blazing, once you had that license to kill, that was probably some of the more enjoyable combat to me personally. The gunplay felt really good in my opinion. It felt satisfying and very rewarding overall. Something that I loved was that headshots were just so satisfying, and the fact that throughout the entire game, headshots were just a one-shot kill was not only very immersive, but just very, very enjoyable. Obviously, a lot of the enemy characters ended up having helmets, so it wasn't really a one-shot kill in a lot of the later missions, but that's one way that a lot of games out there sort of lose the immersion factor, because at some point, characters just stop being a one-shot headshot, and it kind of doesn't really make that much sense. Whereas in this game, I felt they did that really well, where you could clearly see if someone had a helmet, they weren't going to be a one-shot headshot, and then there were the more like brute enemies that came on much later in the game that actually took 3 to 4 headshots to even just remove their helmet. But even then, it just felt so satisfying to pop that helmet off and then hit them with a single headshot knowing that they were going to die. And mixed with that really, really fluid gunplay, I thought that was very, very well done. With those progressively more difficult enemies though, the other enjoyable side of that was that it kind of forced you to try new things. Instead of just aiming for the head and getting an instant kill, you had to try and like explode different barrels or use gadgets to set traps for enemies and stuff like that. And it felt like as the game progressed, it almost forced your hand a little bit in order to try new things and not just go about the exact same game plan that you'd been going with throughout the rest of the game, because then the gameplay would have probably become a little bit monotonous. But they did a really good job to kind of not let that be the case. It was also nice that ammo was somewhat scarce, forcing you to just not spray and pray. Like I said, you kind of had to aim for the head in order to reserve that ammo. And I've got to say too, I really enjoyed the different variety of weapons. Each class of weapon felt pretty much completely unique from the other classes. I definitely enjoyed the ARs the most, but they all felt really fun in their own right and kind of determined how you had to play. For example, if you had a pistol and an SMG, you kind of had to be a little bit more aggressive and in their face rather than just sitting back, picking people off before moving on. Overall though, I was pleasantly surprised by the gunplay in this game, and I thought it was pretty much on par with really anything out there. It felt super fluid, it felt very rewarding and very satisfying to play. And again, I think that in future games they will only expand on this even more and probably refine that to an even better degree. Obviously Hitman has given them plenty of practice with this thing, and it's not like I expected the gunplay to be poor or anything like that, but I think it was just done to a level that I wasn't quite expecting. Now, one area that I was maybe a little bit let down by was the vehicle side of the game, not only in terms of the controls and stuff, but I thought there might be just some more car chase sequences than there were, albeit it was a short game, so it's not really the end of the world, but it felt like they could have maybe thrown a few extra car chase sequences in there. Now, in terms of the controls, to be completely fair, I played on mouse and keyboard, which I don't know if that was the play or not. It just felt very nice and responsive to me when I started playing. So I was on mouse and keyboard, and that was great for the general gameplay, but unfortunately for the vehicle gameplay, it didn't really work quite as well as I imagined a controller would have. Maybe that's on me. Maybe I should have just plugged in a controller while I was in vehicles and stuff. But that was, like I said, one area where I did feel slightly let down, just because what we'd seen in the trailers and stuff looked really, really good, and then it just didn't feel as though it played as well in game. Not to say it was done poorly by any means, but it did just at times feel like we weren't driving all that quick. It felt like it was a little bit slower than it should have been, and because the controls weren't overly amazing either, at least again on mouse and keyboard, that did feel like a little bit of a letdown to me. That being said, each of the different vehicle missions were still really fun. It probably sounded very negative saying that it was really bad or something like that, but that was not the case. Pretty much every mission involving vehicles was still fun. I think the chase after the chess tournament was an absolute classic, which I'll touch on a little bit more in a second, and the quarry section as well as the like dump truck through London section were both really fun moments for me as well. So despite some kind of nitpicks about the vehicle gameplay, ironically, all of those missions were actually still very, very fun in my opinion. Now, moving on a little bit more to the story side of things, and for me, this is where this game absolutely excelled. Now, for a bit of context, I enjoy James Bond, but I'm by no means like a huge James Bond fan. I've only seen probably 3 or 4 of the movies, and although I've enjoyed them, I'm definitely not like a super fan of James Bond. But this game, for me, has actually made me a big fan of James Bond to the point where now I want to go back and watch like every single James Bond movie and really get myself into the Bond franchise, because I just love the way that this story was told. And I really loved seeing Bond's introduction to MI6 and being a part of the 00 agents. Now, something that I've got to get off my chest is that the intro and the tutorial for this game were some of the best that I have played in a very long time, if not ever, to be honest. The intro mission was very good, but I wouldn't say that was the best intro to a game of all time. But I will, with chest, say that the tutorial section for 007 First Light is easily, by quite a long margin, the best tutorial that I have ever played in any game. The absolute speed at which you just progress through this tutorial, learning pretty much everything that there is to know about the game in such a small amount of time, all of it feeling action-packed, all of it suiting the story, and all of it being genuinely fun to take part in, that is something that is very rare for me when it comes to a tutorial. I'm sure most of you would agree that generally a tutorial section of a game is often the more boring part that you kind of just want to get through early on in the game, you know that it has to be done and you try and learn all of the key information and stuff. But generally speaking, we want to get past the tutorial and get out into the actual game where it's no longer holding our hand and we can just get out there and play. That did not feel like the case in 007 First Light. I genuinely would go back and just play the tutorial again multiple times over because I had so much fun doing this. And it's crazy because it wasn't anything mind-blowing. It didn't do anything that was just completely out there. All it really did was just speed things up, and it would just throw you in. You would shoot a couple of enemies. It would then just quickly cut in almost like a montage fashion to the next little mission you were doing. You had to go and like capture a flag. You would finish that, then you had to do a stealth mission and take out a few enemies. You then had to go and like disarm someone. Then you'd have a time trial racing around a track. And each of those individually weren't anything special, but it was just a sort of montage feeling to this that just felt so good. Not only again from a story perspective, it just suited the story that they were trying to tell in that moment, but it was done at such a pace that you kind of finish and you were just like, holy fuck, I've just learned every single thing about this game in what felt like about 3 minutes, even though I'm sure it went for a lot longer than that, but it definitely did not feel like it. Now, a huge part of that early section of the game, mostly the tutorial, but even beyond that too, were some of the key characters, with probably the most prominent early on being Cressida and Monroe, who were definitely an instant connection for me. Now, these were the typical kind of like envious rivals or competitors who almost want to see you fail, but they eventually push you to greatness. And then eventually, through the camaraderie of going through all of that difficulty together, they come around to being really close friends. I love those kinds of storylines, and I thought it was so well done in this game. Initially, when you get introduced to the rest of the 00 agents, it feels as though everyone just hates you and no one wants you to be there, which is definitely the case. But seeing it go from that situation to eventually being some of the best friends that Bond has likely ever had, I thought that was really well done. And again, it was done very quickly, but without feeling rushed. It's kind of like an hour of playtime and you're just like best friends with these people, but you can tell that that relationship was formed over a few weeks or months. And it was just great to see where they ended up seeing going out drinking or grabbing food. And it really just felt like a nice place to land with those relationships before, unfortunately, all of these characters pretty much dying. Now, something I think a lot of people might miss there is that Cressida didn't actually die. Obviously, we do see her in the game after this, but she's in a wheelchair and then we really just never see anything from her again. We don't know her fate, but it was pretty much confirmed in a later mission when you're at the web like gala event thing. And although it's a missable piece of dialogue, if you go and speak to Stephen Bright, who is Cressida's father, he mentions that she will most likely be able to walk again. And so I thought that was really interesting. It kind of leads me to believe she may potentially be in the sequel to this game. It did feel kind of strange that she didn't die and then we just still never see her. I kind of thought she maybe would play a role with the team, maybe even like a Moneypenny type role where she was just on comms for the team or something, but we just never hear of her again pretty much. But hearing that little nod there that she probably will eventually learn to walk again and stuff, that makes me wonder, could she potentially show up in the sequel? Now, the storyline surrounding Greenway was pretty much that same trope that I mentioned with Cressida and Monroe, but on absolute steroids. He borderline hated Bond for like 80% of the game. But again, going through hardships together and seeing how special of an agent Bond was, Greenway does eventually come around. It is genuinely sad that it really only became a friendship for a very short while before obviously Greenway died. Although that was a great story moment, I would have loved to have seen more of that relationship. Two really good characters that bounced off each other amazingly, and I think there was a lot of story to be told there, but unfortunately it just didn't go that way. And obviously we have to say goodbye to Greenway, who to me was one of the clear standouts of this game. One of my favorite and probably most iconic missions in this game was that mission in the web offices after hours. You and Greenway are trying to infiltrate it and you've got to kind of do most of the work because obviously he's in a sling. Now, the banter between those two in that mission was absolutely amazing, and you could very much tell that Greenway had started to come around to Bond after the results of their last few missions, but he almost didn't want Bond to see that he was feeling that way because he probably knew Bond would never let him hear the end of it. And so although they're clearly coming around to each other a little bit, it felt as though there was still this like venom in all of the banter between them. And for me, that's probably why that is one of the most iconic missions in this game, just seeing that relationship and where it got to between those two characters. Now, I'm probably going off on a tangent here, but something that I would love to see is some sort of like Greenway spin-off game, whether it's a game or whether it's even just like a freaking comic series or something. I would love to see some early days Greenway, because for me, he was a character that I absolutely loved in this game. It is very rare that a non-protagonist grabs me like he did, but he is easily one of my favorite characters in the game, and arguably a character that I actually enjoyed more than James Bond himself, which says a lot because I did enjoy James Bond in this game. I thought Patrick Gibson did an amazing job, but I thought Lenny James did an even better job playing Greenway, a character that had quite a lot of depth to him. And like I said, despite his initial grievances with James Bond, he eventually comes around and ultimately actually saves him towards the end of the story. Now, I've spoken a bit about some of the classic or like iconic missions throughout this game, and for me, there's probably about 5 or 6 different missions that really stood out as being clearly the best missions in the game, or at least for me anyway. Now, very early on, we obviously have the nightclub mission, which felt like such a good intro mission for the 00 agents, kind of getting their hands dirty in a nightclub. And although it's definitely overshadowed by some of the later missions, I absolutely loved the dynamic situations that you can find yourself in this mission, where you need to find X or Y way to get into an area, none of which are readily apparent. You kind of have to do a bit of digging in order to get to those areas. There's the moment where the blonde girl tries to like sweet talk you while you're tailing someone, and you've got to potentially either chat her up or just palm her off and keep following the guy, but then that can eventually lead to her boyfriend coming along and trying to get in the middle of things, at which point you just beat him up in the bathroom. And that entire mission for me just set the tone for the rest of the game, that things were not really going to go the way that we initially thought they would, and that there was almost always going to be a spanner thrown in the works throughout all of these different missions. There was then the whole like chess tournament mission, as well as the chase sequence that followed that too. And this was kind of the first big mission, and it was definitely one of the most iconic. It's probably the mission that I think of first when I think of this game. Now, not only was the location just an awesome place for a mission like this, but there were some huge implications for the story here with the whole 009 stuff, the white-haired twins who become to know as the Murdo twins, and ultimately the entire mission just not being what they initially thought it was going to be. It then resulted in that epic chase sequence and then the whole airfield and plane sequence, which, look, maybe I'm saying the word iconic too many times in this video, but for me, those have now become iconic when it comes to some of my favorite missions that I've played in recent years. They kind of felt like some proper Uncharted missions, and I remember just after I finished the plane sequence, sitting there and being like, what the hell have I just played? That was absolutely insane, and even messaging a few friends saying how awesome that was, because I knew that they were further ahead in the story than me. Even just a little thing in this mission that was so like out of the box was stuff like controlling the plane to move everything side to side. That was such a unique way to make an already very cool mission even more exciting. If all that level entailed was just getting from sort of the back of the plane to the cockpit and you just had to fight your way through a bunch of enemies, that would have been awesome in itself. But the fact that you could actually kind of add turbulence to the plane, knocking everything around, and sometimes even just killing enemies by simply just like moving a truck into them and stuff, I just thought that was so well done. And those are the little things in this game that really took it from just a very solid game to a game that to me is probably not quite on masterpiece level, but it is honestly not far off, because of all of those little additions that they didn't really need to add, but they still added them and definitely took that game to another level. Another mission that I absolutely loved was the whole Aleph storyline. It is kind of your first mission with Greenway, and you could definitely tell how much Greenway absolutely hated it. Now, one thing I'll say about this mission is that Lenny Kravitz had less of a role than I expected. I actually went into this game thinking he might be, if not the main villain, definitely one of, but he was pretty much just exclusively in this mission, and that was it. But that being said, it was still pretty cool to see him in the game. Now, what I loved about this mission was it kind of felt like the first, not really open world mission, but the first mission where you could genuinely just go and approach it however you wanted. I guess the nightclub did that to a much lesser extent, but in this mission you had to get your hands on 100k, and there were definitely multiple different ways to do it. And I honestly might go back and just replay that mission to kind of see how many alternative paths there were, because there were multiple times where I thought I was on the right track and I was going to do one mission where I thought that would result in me getting a bunch of money. On the way there, I'd find something else that actually led me down a different path, and then I kind of just accidentally was like in the midst of a different side quest that resulted in me making like 60 grand and didn't even need to do the initial side quest that I was planning on doing. So I feel like there were a lot of different ways to approach that. And for me, that is definitely something that I enjoy in this type of game, having multiple different approaches and kind of playing the missions how you want to play them. It's also worth mentioning too about Aleph that honestly, it just had an awesome vibe too. It was just out in the desert in like rusted up ships. I just thought that was really cool because a lot of times in, you know, spy thriller type games, it's more urban settings. So getting a setting like that, I just thought was really, really exciting. Some of the more, I guess, typical James Bond settings were also in the whole web convention and then the web offices too. This was where the story really began to heat up. And like I said earlier, these were some of the more like iconic missions to me. They were very classic Bond type missions, being in a social setting at kind of like a fancy dress gala and you're there to just snuff out an enemy. That is exactly the sort of thing that I wanted from this game. And those missions definitely scratched that itch for me. Like I said earlier with Aleph, it was cool to be in different locations, but I also think you kind of need to have those more urban fancy dress situations in a James Bond game. And I thought these missions were definitely very well done. The last area that I wanted to touch on as well was the whole Vietnam sequence of the game. This is where you were obviously tracking the 3 different targets. We didn't know which one was the actual target, and we had to find ways to access all of them in order to kind of keep them safe, and then obviously the chaos that ensued afterwards. This whole thing was such a great mission in my opinion, and it was also in an awesome setting too. Like I said about Aleph, it was awesome to just see a completely unique area. You don't always want to be in like urban areas or fancy dress parties, but being in the desert and in this case in a jungle resort in Vietnam, it was just an awesome setting for the game in my opinion. We were also introduced to Teresa Lorca, who is in my opinion the fittest Bond girl of all time now already. I saw people calling this game woke because M and Moneypenny were women of color and they were saying that this was just some woke nonsense, and then we just see this absolute baddie that Bond spends pretty much half his time just simping over in the whole Vietnam sequence and eventually gets into bed with. So I don't know how people were calling this game woke. That is the least woke thing I have ever laid my eyes on, to be honest. And like I said, I personally believe she is now the fittest Bond girl of all time. Now, there were obviously plenty of different twists in the story as well. For me, the whole Webb and Damien storyline was absolutely awesome, as well as the twist regarding Thea as well. Now, Thea was made out to be this like all-knowing AI that essentially knew everything about everything. And to find out that it had actually consistently been wrong and that Webb and Damien were out there pretty much covering up its tracks, doing awful things, that was a really great twist in the storyline in my opinion. I thought the dynamic between Webb and his son Damien was great. There was that typical like father and his kind of disappointing, troubled son. And I thought it worked really well here in my opinion. One thing I'll say about Damien is that I could kind of tell he didn't die in this moment. It just felt like this was definitely not an actual death scene. And you can see here, I left a note when I was taking notes on the game during my playthrough that I put death in quotation marks because it just felt like one of those deaths that he would definitely come back from. And I was absolutely not shocked when that was the case. Now, what I'll say is I'm not entirely sure how I feel about his like exosuit comeback situation. Don't get me wrong, it was really cool from a gameplay perspective. I think that final sort of mission facing Damien was very fun, and it was almost kind of like a horror. He's hunting you down and you can't really damage him without just making the most of your environment, but it felt maybe a little bit too unrealistic for me. Not that Bond is always like ultra realistic, but I do think it's generally grounded in reality far more often than not, at least in terms of the villains, for example. So that is maybe a bit of a nitpick, I'm not too sure, but I thought that was a bit of an odd choice, albeit, like I said, a fun one from a gameplay perspective. Now, for me, I think the thing that really surprised me the most about this game was just the overall quality. I always kind of knew this game was going to be a pretty fun story-driven game, but I was not expecting it to have the quality, the attention to detail, and the bordering on perfection in a lot of areas that it actually had throughout this game. Now, for me, cinematography was a huge part of this. I thought the cinematography and like the cutscene details were amazingly well done. People call these sorts of games movie games, but they say it as almost like a derogatory term, like it's a bad thing, which for me personally, I've never really understood that whole, like, that game is just a playable movie. You hear that about The Last of Us and God of War and those sort of games, but I've never understood the negative connotations to that. To me, that is a positive if a game can have such good storytelling, have such good cutscenes and cinematics and stuff that it feels like a movie at times. I don't see the negative to that. And the people who will say that will then also just probably go and spend their weekend watching a movie and watching TV during the week. I don't get why it's fine for a movie to be like a movie, but then for a game to not have, you know, movie moments in terms of cutscenes. I've never understood that personally. So if you do feel that way, leave a comment down below and kind of explain why you feel that way. But for me, I've always thought that's a positive thing. Don't get me wrong, not every game needs to be like that. I think like open world RPGs, games like Skyrim or Elden Ring, for example, they don't need to be a movie game. But in a game like this that's IP focused and it's a story driven game, that is a good thing. And I thought that was so well done in this game. The whole like cutscene side of the game was borderline perfect in my eyes. I also thought the level design and just the quality of those levels in this game was absolutely amazing. There were so many awesome sequences where you really needed to think about how to actually get to the next area or approach that situation in the best way possible. For me, the web offices was kind of the standout in that regard, having to use the cleaning robots to access the areas that you couldn't open yourself, but you had to actually find how to access the cleaning robot control panels. I really enjoyed those sequences. They were kind of like a puzzle built into the map. It didn't initially scream puzzle by any means, and for me, I definitely really enjoy gameplay and level design when it's done in that regard. Something else of honestly the highest quality in this game was just some of the absolutely obscene details at times. There were moments that you can see such fine details on a character. One that I took note of was this moment here where we see Bond is clearly angry with M about her decision during this part of the game. And you can literally see him doing like nasal flares as he holds back his frustration, which is a detail that you just generally don't see in most games. Later on, we also see Roger Finch physically shaking while he's pointing his gun at Bond. He clearly doesn't have the cojones to be in that situation, so he's visibly shitting himself despite trying to hide it. And not only can you see him shaking, but you can also hear it in his voice too. And I think a lot of the crazy details in this game when it comes to the characters not only comes down to the developers and the animators, but it also comes down to just great acting performances from essentially every single actor that took part in this game. Even just the overall attention to detail was really solid in this game. There were such subtle things, like for example, I noticed early on that the doors to the Thayer room were shaped like the classic Bond gun barrel shot. It was just little things like that throughout the game that really stood out, and you could kind of tell that the devs put their heart and soul into the details in this game. But ultimately, it doesn't matter how high quality the game is, it doesn't matter how good the gameplay was or the story, it needed to feel like a James Bond game, and that's something that again I think they absolutely nailed in this game. This definitely felt like a James Bond game, even with it being kind of an origin story in a far younger James Bond than we've really ever seen before. The banter throughout the game was perfectly well done in my opinion. There was quite a lot of it, but it was never too far. I think sometimes you can kind of get that level of banter that can be almost like cringy if it's done too much, but I thought that they kind of hit the sweet spot there. Another huge part of James Bond is obviously the girls involved in these games, and throughout this game Bond bangs 3 absolute baddies, and it definitely felt like they leaned into the kind of like womanizer that James Bond is. I'm not gonna lie, these days I didn't think that they would actually go down that path. I kind of thought that's a bit of a taboo thing to be doing in 2026, even though myself, I couldn't care less about that. But I think the internet has the potential to kind of blow up over these things, but I'm really glad that they went down that path. That is who James Bond is. He is a bit of a womanizer, and that is kind of part of the charm of James Bond, and they very much leaned into that in this game as well. The action sequences also felt very James Bond-esque, as well as kind of a dash of like Uncharted and Mission Impossible thrown in there as well. It also felt like there were plenty of little nods to Bond throughout as well, like for example the whole stop touching your ear moment, and something that I actually didn't realize initially, but St. John Smythe, or St. John Smythe as it's pronounced in this game, is a throwback to A View to a Kill from 1985, where that same sort of joke plays out. And so they definitely knew their stuff when they were making this game, and there's probably plenty of stuff as well that went over my head too. But ultimately, the part of the game that felt the most James Bond was definitely the ending. I thought the end to this game was absolutely fantastic, and it actually left me with chills. Like finishing the game and rolling credits, I was just sat there thinking, holy fuck, this is an absolute classic James Bond game now. The way that they finally used the Bond theme right at the end of the game after not hearing it the entire time was absolutely perfect in my opinion. You could kind of tell that was going to happen. I thought that the fact we hadn't heard it the entire game, it felt obvious they were going to eventually throw it in there, and it felt like that would happen right at the end. But even kind of knowing that was going to happen, it still gave me chills when this moment happened.
Thought you'd never ask.
That obviously followed with the classic gun barrel James Bond moment, and then after that we got James Bond Will Return. To me, the absolute perfect ending to this game. Now, the future that this sets up for this franchise, which is why I've kind of made this video saying that James Bond is back when it comes to the gaming side of things. The future of this franchise in gaming is going to be absolutely special. Now, there's obviously the whole storyline with Isola, who we didn't really even talk about in this video, but there is clearly a thread there that is going to be a huge part of the next game or multiple games. Now, I think she is potentially going to be working with Spectre, or definitely something big anyway, and I'm very excited to see where that storyline goes. To me, it felt awesome with Bond having kind of like a co-running rival who is not just a rival, but someone he actually likes, and one of the girls he gets into bed with throughout the game as well. So that's kind of an interesting storyline where these are characters that have been flirting throughout. They've literally slept together. That's adding to the tension between the two, who are clearly now some sort of like rivals, but they're not rivals out of hate. They're just both doing a job. And I think that's going to make for a great storyline moving forward. To me, it shows how confident they were with this game to actually just end the game with James Bond will return, not just with an open ending where it kind of could have gone anywhere, but they very clearly set up a sequel here. And let's get it straight, this game could have been an absolute flop if it didn't have the level of quality that it did, because from that initial trailer that we saw, most people were saying this game was going to be an absolute flop. Hell, even myself, who is generally more on the positive side of things, I kind of looked at that trailer and thought, yeah, that's the most like 7 out of 10 game of all time. And the fact that they ended the game in such a way shows that they clearly had a lot of confidence in this game, because ending it that way, if it was a flop, that would have kind of made them a bit of a laughing stock in my opinion. I can genuinely see this game being kind of like a staple franchise moving forward, with almost unlimited entries into the series. It's crazy to say that James Bond is back in a big way when it comes to gaming. Like I said, it's been, I think, about 13 years since the last James Bond game, and even like I said, there was that era of James Bond games that kind of just didn't live up to the hype. And to say so confidently now that we are back is a very good feeling, and it leaves me very excited to see where this franchise goes in the future. With all of that being said though, I'm very keen to hear your thoughts on 007 First Light. This is probably one of the most enjoyable games that I've played in a long time. For me, this is absolutely going to be a Game of the Year nominee. Now, it's not going to win Game of the Year, let's be honest, because GTA is coming out, and hell, even just in September alone, there's probably going to be like a multiple Game of the Year nominees. So I don't think it wins it, but for me, I'd be shocked if this is not in the final 6 nominees when it comes to the Game Awards. Not that the Game Awards is the be all and end all, but for me, that's generally a good way to kind of judge my opinion against other people's and see if that is generally the consensus. And like I said, I'd be shocked if that is not the case. But with that said, I would love to hear all of your thoughts, so be sure to leave them down below. But with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day, and I'll catch you all in the next one.